My name's Andy Jackson. I'm the technical lead for the UK Web Archive, and I wanted to give a presentation, a brief presentation today about the state of full text search at the UK Web Archive. Now, before we get into the technical details, I want to touch a bit on the motivation for doing this at all. So, why do we want to bother with full text search for web archives? Not all web archives are full text search. What makes it worth the effort? So, the primary reason is it's hard to find things at scale. We've worked very hard over the last 15 years at the UK Web Archive to catalogue by hand hundreds of thousands, well, 150,000 different URLs. And that's a very valuable effort. It makes sure all the most culturally important stuff is found and findable by our researchers. But it's only ever going to scratch the surface of all of the content that we hold. We do domain crawls as well, and each one of those visits 24 million different hosts. And so the number that we can manually catalog is always going to be a tiny fraction of the mass. And of course, as we know, if an end user knows the URL they want to find, then that's fine. They can go and find it in any of these crawls. But if they're not sure which URL they want to then to open up the mass of URLs that haven't been catalogued, we need to use things like full text search. So that discoverability, findability at scale is the primary motivation for doing full text search. However, there was another motivation. There was a slightly less, a more open-ended desire to kind of find ways of understanding our collection for our own purposes, for access and for preservation, but also to understand it as a way of understanding the culture that created the web. So there was a recognition that we needed to somehow find some way of doing analytics and analysis, things a bit like the Google Books Ngram viewer, but for web archives, maybe taking into account how formats change over time and how links and relationships change over time in the web. So those were the two kind of motivations going into this. So within that framework, what's the strategy? Well, back when this work began, there was kind of these were the primary kind of technical aspects of the strategy. We're always a small team, you know, as with every team in web archiving. There's only quite a small number of people working on it, so we can't build a load of stuff from scratch. We have to build an open source, minimize the amount of custom code we're developing, contribute code back to open source projects rather than having our own where possible. And even where contributing code isn't really possible, we can still kind of feedback any bugs or other challenging cases we find. This is one of the great things about web archives. They're so varied and complex that you're bound to come across interesting edge cases and oddities that you can then feed back to the tool developers we're working with. Alongside that, we also wanted to encourage reuse. So this means not only making the tools and documentation openly available as well, but to try and make the tools modular, configurable, extensible, so that other people wanting to use parts of the toolkit don't have to do everything just like we do at the UK Web Archive. For example, we run a big parallel Hadoop cluster to do our analysis on, but you don't need one of those to run our indexing toolkit. It's all separated out and modular. To complement that, we try to provide a quick start kind of documentation so that people can try things out relatively quickly. And also, you know, over the years, we've tried to promote the tools and the use of the tools through publications and events. So that's been the kind of technical strategy. And the kind of design strategy has really been about partnering with researchers. So a few years ago now, but there were two important projects in this angle. There was the ARDA, or Analytical Access to the Dark Domain Archive project, which was a smallish JISC-funded project, which only worked with a handful of researchers very briefly, but helped us understand how to index large collections and how to start making them more accessible for researchers. And then more influentially, after that came the big UK domain data for the Arts and Humanities project, the Buddha project, which did a much more detailed partnership with researchers, providing them with bursaries to explore, work with us and write up reports on their experiences. And this was very helpful, very powerful. And during that process, we were able to develop tools around those researcher needs. And that's where we started to get into the kind of analytical aspects and the kind of trend analysis that we see here. So that was a kind of strategic approach. That work was a while ago, so I want to give kind of an update on the status of where things are now. And well, there's good news and there's bad news. So back in 2016, at the end of the Buddha project, the tools, it kind of ecosystem, so to speak, looked like this. So we were taking our walks, putting them through the indexing toolkit, and then using that to populate Apache Solr. And then in the Arda project, we used Drupal to provide a faster search interface. And then in the Buddha project, the follow-up, we developed our own Shine user interface, which provided more complex interactions and trend analysis. Now, since then, things have changed quite a lot. Thanks to the various collaborators and contributors who've donated code and made new projects around the code base over the years, we now have more options. So, as well as simple things like you can output to XML instead of using Apache Solr, you can also now output to Elasticsearch or OpenSearch. And this opens up a whole new set of possibilities. So the thing about Elasticsearch, which is quite good, is that it's very popular in a lot of kind of technology companies and startups and that kind of thing. So there's been a lot of development of tools around Elasticsearch which let you explore content you've indexed into Elasticsearch without you having to kind of build your own. So there's things like Kibana, which the Elasticsearch company used to make logs accessible. There's Grafana, which is a similar project but is more focused on monitoring and alerts. There's a nice project called Metabase, which provides kind of a rich query language style interface, very good for building dashboards and analysis and reports based on something like Elasticsearch. And there's a similar one called Apache Superset, which is part of the Apache suite, and can also just be pointed at an Elasticsearch index, and straight away you can start poking around, making nice dashboards and graphics and all that kind of stuff. So that's what kind of one option now using this toolkit. And then going back to Apache Solr, as well as the Drupal we did in the past and the Shine user interface, which we still run, the UK Web Archive started developing its own kind of simplified end user search tool called UKWE, which is now part of our website, which are fine, but both of those are kind of a bit suboptimal, a bit too close to the UK Web Archive's own requirements and not that reusable. So it's been really positive to see two other projects within the Web Archive space looking at developing web archiving specific search interfaces. So one of those was Walklight, which was by Nick Gruen, developed a walk specific set of extensions and configuration for built on top of the Blacklight Ruby framework, which is quite widely used, particularly in American universities. So if you're already a Rails shop or you can run Rails, then Walklight's a really good option for exploring web archives. And another option, which we'll be seeing more of in the conference, is Solr Wayback from the Danish Web Archive, which is quite an exciting development. It's and one we've been starting to experiment with ourselves. So as you can see, the tool ecosystem's really come a long way since the earlier days of this work, and there's more options for how to interact with these indexes. The development of Solr Wayback has kind of opened up for us the possibility of sharing our search tools with other web archives, with the Danish Web Archive. So these are just a couple of screenshots of Solr Wayback, having successfully set it up as an internal tool. So now it's you have to log in to our curator service to get access to it. But once you're in, you can run searches using Solr Wayback against our indexes. And this has got some positive feedback from our internal curators. Now, unfortunately, for our public website, the user interface has to be translated into multiple languages and it has to be accessible. And as it is, Solr Wayback doesn't meet either of those two constraints. So for right now, we can't offer it as a public service. But as a researcher service, it's looking good. And it's something we can run internally and get them start to understand what we can do with. So that's all the good news. The bad news is that in that intervening period, we did hit some performance issues, which we've not managed to get to the bottom of. So we found text search is pretty darn fast. You need good quality hardware to run it on. You need kind of SSD drives and quite a lot of them for indexes of this size, but it all works really well. Also, the kind of faceting and counting that you need to start to do those analytics. How many hits for this word were there in this year? That's also pretty fast. However, text search and lots of facets, when you bring them all together, it starts to all slow down, particularly if there's lots of common words in that search query. So we're already seeing kind of performance issues we didn't know how to manage for best. But then on top of that, when we put in more and more collections and we start to get into the tens of billions of, we start to get over about 10 billion hits in the whole collection, we started to see kind of significant performance drops for those large collections, and we didn't really understand why that was happening, and we've not had the time to get into that and really understand that yet. So we've hit this kind of performance issue, which is odd because I'm pretty sure the Danish Web Archive run larger indexes and don't see the same performance issue. So there's something to be understood in that. This indexing backlog then causes us to pause our, the processing performance. Then the performance issue then causes us to pause our indexing process. So that was the initial reason we started pausing our backlog. But then there's also been some initial other work, focus on the crawler, changes to how we do automation, which meant our indexing for full text search is now quite out of date. We're only up to 2019 for curated crawls, and we're way back to 2015 for domain crawls. So that's the state of things as they are now. What of the future? Well, so obviously, from what I've said, our primary goal will be working on our Solar service and addressing those issues. So one part of the issue is it's on Solar 6 and it needs updating to Solar 8 or possibly 9, which is just out. We need to make sure we're indexing and automating the indexing of our created crawls properly, and we need to get into those performance issues and understand what's going on so that we can keep growing the index. What we also hope to do in the future is grow this community around tools. So, review the code and the documents, update dependencies, be active on GitHub and review issues and pull requests. But along with that, we'd really like to collect examples of use to help inspire us and inspire others. We know a number of web archives are now using this toolkit in one way or another, and we'd really like to pull together some more of that information about who's using it and who's thinking about using it more, and who's using it with what tools, and so we can start to understand what we might be able to do in the future. And so we'd also like to run more events like this to kind of try and help grow the community around the tools and understand what everyone's doing. And finally, to support the toolkit, it would be nice to consider proposing some IIPC projects to build things out. So, for example, if there's interest among the IIPC members, we could look at a project to support internationalization and accessibility in Solar Wayback. Apart from that, we could look at possibly getting some kind of deep dive into the performance issues, and getting an external party to look at that might really be helpful. And would it's something we've struggled to get time to prioritize in-house, so that would be really useful if someone could help us understand how to get the most out of these systems. And I'd also be interested in more broad ideas about for some use cases it might make sense to look at alternative backends, things like maybe things we could do with Elasticsearch, or also different backends like it would be possible to put a lot of this data into data analysis data formats like Parquet. There's a Apache project called Apache Iceberg, which helps orchestrate this, and this allows you to run kind of SQL style queries across complex data sets, which might be a really good way of filling out the analytics use case, even if it's only something we can do in for some queries, and full text search is still best left with things like Solar and Elasticsearch. Right. Well, that's all I had to say. That's the status of things at the UK Web Archive as of today. So thank you, and I welcome any questions in real life.